to the danger room with you.
Back in 1994, there were few things in this world that meant more to me than video games. But a couple of things that at least came close were cartoons and comic books. In particular, I was a huge fan of Marvel Comics in the early 90s, but my absolute favorite superheroes were definitely the X-Men. At the time, the art and the characters were just about as cool as anything could ever be. At least that was the opinion of my 8-year-old self. Basically, if a comic book had X in the title, whether that be X-Men, X-Factor, or X-Force, I was going to read it, especially if it prominently featured my two favorite X-Men, Gambit and Wolverine.
He better be more careful with his mouth.
You better stop worrying about my mouth and start worrying about these.
So, as you might imagine, I was a huge fan of the X-Men animated series on Fox Kids that started airing in 1992. It was such an awesome show that prominently featured all of my favorite characters from the comics and condensed some of the contemporary stories at the time into a shorter and easy to understand format, and it was supremely entertaining. The animation was great, especially in that epic intro, plus the voice performances were fantastic too. Also, while it was obviously a kids show, some of the subject matter X-Men dealt with and how much it focused on the interpersonal relationships of the characters made me feel like I was watching a big kids show. Anyway, if I wasn't watching cartoons or flipping through comics, you could find me playing video games, my first love. I played anything I could get my hands on, but if I ever saw the very recognizable Capcom logo on a cartridge, that was the game that was going squarely in my SNES, but none held my attention better than Mega Man X and Street Fighter II, the perfect combo of action platformer and fighting game. If I ever got tired of one, I could jump right over to the other. But then, one fateful day, I learned that Capcom and Marvel would be teaming up to produce an X-Men fighting game, and it was like a dream come true. The game was going to be called X-Men Children of the Atom, and it was going to feature some of my favorite superheroes duking it out one-on-one in a manner not unlike my beloved Street Fighter. I was strapped in and ready to have my face melted by awesomeness. But first, there was an SNES game.
Optic Blast! X-Men!
In November of 1994, Capcom unleashed X-Men Mutant Apocalypse onto the world, and it immediately became one of my absolute favorite SNES games. If Children of the Atom was reported to be a blend of X-Men and Street Fighter, this game felt like a blend of several of Capcom's flagship games all rolled into one. It had the graphics and sound of a Mega Man X game, as well as some light platforming elements. At its core, though, Mutant Apocalypse is a beat-em-up, not unlike Final Fight, but it has you playing on a strictly 2D plane, which works to the game's advantage because that means you can easily pull off special attacks ripped straight from Street Fighter. So if you already know how to do a Hadouken or a Shoryuken, then you're all set to kick some serious ass with Optic Blasts and Berserker Claws. Other X-Men games always map these powers to a single button press and limited their use in some way, but here, as long as you can perform the button combos, you can use your special powers as much as you want, which, by the way, is how it should be. Anyway, this was an amazing game for its day. It featured 5 playable characters and a simple story about infiltrating the island of Genosha, destroying its infrastructure, freeing the captive mutants, and ultimately facing down and defeating Apocalypse. Of course, it then throws you a curveball in the form of Magneto planning to destroy the human race, requiring you to then go to Asteroid M for a final showdown with the Master of Magnetism himself. Mutant Apocalypse featured some truly outstanding graphics and sound, plus gameplay that was at times quite challenging but remained consistently fun. And seeing as this was only Capcom's second game based on a Marvel property, with 1993's The Punisher being their first, a standard of excellence had already been set, and I was ready to have my socks knocked off and my brain absolutely melted by what would come next.
Berserker Barrage!
X-Men!
X-Men Children of the Atom hit arcades in December of 1994 and has the distinction of being the very first Capcom fighting game based on a Marvel property, which is a relationship that obviously spanned many years and gave us tons of great games to enjoy. But how did they do on their first outing? Honestly, if you're accustomed to some of the versus fighters that Capcom developed in later years, Children of the Atom comes off as being rather quaint by comparison. It initially offers you 10 playable characters to choose from, with a few secret boss characters thrown in for good measure, and the gameplay is generally quite a bit slower and more traditional than something like Marvel vs. Capcom, for example, which is not to say that it's a straight Street Fighter clone, because it certainly isn't. That's what I was expecting at the time, a simple melding of X-Men and Street Fighter, but Children of the Atom has more in common with another Capcom fighting series that made its debut in 1994, that being Darkstalkers. This makes sense considering that the X-Men characters and the Darkstalkers characters are similarly very different from the characters found in Street Fighter. Applying the classic button commands for special attacks still makes sense, but when those special attacks are eye lasers, ice blasts, and drill claws coming from characters who are more than merely human, it makes sense to also alter the way they move and attack to feel more supernatural. In fact, the only Street Fighter character that Capcom thought was worthy of throwing down with the X-Men, at least in 1994, was Akuma, a character who also made his debut earlier that year, and who was also decidedly superhuman. The gameplay in Children of the Atom is still pretty solid to this day. It features a combo system that's kind of basic, but would be refined over time, a super combo meter that was still something of a new mechanic in 1994, and it allowed you to dash and super jump, which again were not common mechanics in fighting games at the time. The selection of characters was varied, including some deep cuts like Spiral and the Silver Samurai, both of which I knew from the comics and the cartoon, but weren't what you would call instantly recognizable characters to non-fans. And going along with that, the stages also draw inspiration from the comics, giving us some classic X-Men locales to fight in, including the Savage Land, the Danger Room, Asteroid M, and probably my favorite, Mojo World. Both the characters and stages are highly detailed and fairly accurate to their portrayal in the comics, albeit with some appropriate Capcom alterations. And overall, this is a pretty impressive looking game. It's colorful and vibrant, and definitely set the standard for how Marvel fighters and Capcom fighters in general would look going forward. On top of the solid gameplay and great visuals, Children of the Atom features one of my favorite soundtracks from this era of Capcom fighters, right up there with great OSTs like Darkstalkers, Street Fighter Alpha, and Street Fighter the Movie. Yes, despite whatever flaws that game might have, the soundtrack is not one of them. The music here is not only very listenable on its own, but also matches perfectly with each character it's given to. So light and playful in the case of Iceman and his Ice on the Beach stage, or more intense heroic music to go with Cyclops and his Danger Room stage. The entire soundtrack is pure gold and matches perfectly with the visuals, the characters, and the action. And that's ultimately a great way to describe the game as a whole. Everything just sort of matches perfectly. These characters, this gameplay style, the graphics and sound, it all just fits together so well, and it's no wonder that this is a pairing, that being Capcom and Marvel, that would bear fruit for decades to come. If you're a fighting game fan but you've never tried Children of the Atom, it's certainly worth going back to. Even 30 years later, it still holds up as a solid and fun fighter. With the start of a brand new X-Men animated series this year, which picks up where the original left off, and Capcom still having a lot of success with Street Fighter, it does make me wonder if a future X-Men fighter could possibly be in the works. I don't know, but my gut says maybe. Regardless, we shouldn't forget the amazing game that started it all, and to this day is still a certified fighting classic. X-Men Children of the Atom was awesome then, and it's awesome now. Excelsior!